So welcome to this joint webinar of the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians and of the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. My name is Alexander Loschke, and I will be moderating this webinar today together with my colleagues Yusi Sang, Sean Lovell, and Panya Yu, and of course my colleague also Haoi Chen from the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. So we are very happy today to have with us Carolina Franco from NORC at the University of Chicago, who will be talking about combining surveys in small area estimations. Researchers, policymakers, and other stakeholders are often interested in obtaining survey estimates of quantities of interest for various subpopulations. This may include estimates for detailed geographic levels for multiple sociodemographic groups or for a combination of both. Frequently, the demand for estimates at granular level exceeds what a survey's sample size and design can support when estimation is done via traditional design-based estimation methods. And this is where small area estimation comes into play, which involves exploiting relationships among domains and borrowing strengths from multiple sources of information to improve inference relative to direct survey methods. This typically involves the use of models whose success depends heavily on the quality and predictive ability of the sources of information used. Possible sources for auxiliary information include administrative records, censuses, big data such as traffic or cell phone data, or previous vintages of the same survey. One rich source of information is that of other surveys. So Carolina will give a review of the topic of combining information from multiple surveys in small area estimation and will provide practical advice and in the technical introduction, illustrating with various applications. She will discuss reasons to combine surveys and give an overview of the most common types of models. Let me now tell you a little bit more about Carolina. Carolina is a principal statistician at NORC at the University of Chicago. She has over 10 years of experience in survey statistics and is an expert on small area estimation. Prior to working at NORC, she spent several years working at the US Census Bureau. And Carolina published several works on small area estimation and related topics and has delivered over 30 invited talks in conferences at universities and so on. She's an associate editor of the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society and is currently serving on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the 2023 Small Area Estimation meeting in Lima, Peru. Before I hand over now to Haoi, so she can also say a few words, let me just say a few practical things. So we will first hear the presentation of our speaker, and then we will have the Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to write comments and questions into the chat at any time. During the Q&A, we can give you the floor so you can ask the question yourself. Or if you wish, we can also ask the question for you. Just let us know. As always, this Global Network webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians at yaml.com/unstats. I have put the link into the meeting chat already, and it will be also shared on the website of the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. So now over to you, Haoi. Floor is yours.
Very quickly, thank you so much, Alex. Thank you for collaborating on this webinar, and thank you so much, Carolina. I know you're super busy. If anyone's interested in submitting a paper to the Smart Estimation Conference in Peru, please go ahead, send me your abstract. Just a few words about the Intersecretary Working Group on Household Surveys. So it is a collaborative group that was established in 2015 to encourage foster survey coordination at the national, regional, global level, and to encourage and promote innovative survey approaches, and really make sure that these innovations can be used in countries, are being adapted and adopted in countries. And third one, we're there to advocate for the importance of household surveys. I guess nobody will contest to that. So today's webinar is really super aligned with our second objective, to really bringing the experiences of our experts and then see what other things that we can really bring to countries. And I'm sure we have countries here with us as well. Thank you for joining us. So one last point, our group just published a paper called Positioning Household Survey for the Next Decade. It consists of 8 technical priorities, and the first one, guess what, is about data integration. So with that, I will share the link to the paper on the chat, and I'll hand over to Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina and Alex, for introducing me and for inviting me to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share the slides now. And so Alex already discussed the topic. I'm just going to jump straight into it. So what is small area estimation? Small area estimation, the goal is to estimate quantities of interest from many geographic and/or demographic domains or subsets of the population. So for instance, we may be interested in estimating poverty for, say, various age groups, and for, say, counties or municipalities or provinces or states. Now, the problem is that surveys often cannot estimate all the quantities we're interested in through traditional direct survey methods with acceptable accuracy. So what happens is that sometimes you have very small sample sizes for some of the areas of interest or domains, and you may end up with some areas with absolutely no sample size. And just to be precise about what I mean when I said direct methods, a direct estimator is based on the sample data for the domain of interest alone. This is a standard definition in the small area literature. And a small area is a domain where the sample size is too small for reliable direct estimation. So just to be clear of our definitions here. So the approach is to use modeling to incorporate information from other domains, and especially from auxiliary data, to borrow strength and decrease measures of uncertainty and so on. So what are some examples of sources of auxiliary information? So the most classic examples often use administrative records. And I put here a reference that might be of interest. This is a book chapter on small area estimation for using administrative records. And we had a nice discussion on how to find covariates, what makes good covariates, what to look out for. So if you're interested in this, you might want to look into this. Or another very common source are censuses. Sometimes we have many years of the same survey, so we can exploit having many years, and typically we'd use temporal models for that. And so a very popular topic of research these days that has a few papers that are very interesting are use of like commercial data, big data, satellite data. This one's been around for a while, actually, cell phone data. So these are other sources of covariates. You can also use spatial information. So perhaps you're estimating, say, anemia for children in provinces, and you know which provinces are next to each other. So this information might help too, in some cases. And another source is other surveys, and this will be the focus of this particular talk. And note that you can use many of these. You don't have to use just one of these. You can use a combination of these things to get the best inference that you could get. So smaller estimation has many benefits if done correctly, and when you can find good auxiliary information, although as I showed, there are many sources of auxiliary information. So it can decrease the measures of uncertainty. So we're talking mean squared errors, variances, coefficients of variations, relative to just using the direct estimators. As a result, it can allow more areas to pass quality thresholds set by surveys. So often national offices are unwilling to publish estimates that don't pass certain quality threshold. Often they use coefficients of variation. So if the coefficient of variation is too high, they won't publish it. So by doing smaller estimation, it allows us to publish statistics that would otherwise be suppressed, which also means often being able to publish, to have products of statistics with lower level of aggregation that you would have if you were just using the direct method. And in addition to that, you can, of course, yield estimates of areas with no survey sample size with many small area techniques. Obviously, there's some assumptions being made, and you need auxiliary information, and you have to be comfortable assuming that your model holds for the areas with no sample. But in many cases, it allows you to provide an estimate when you need one, which would not be possible using just survey data. So just to motivate the talk, I wanted to give an example from one of my projects. Here, we were using the National Health Interview Survey to measure uninsurance rate for health insurance in the United States by state. So this is a relatively small survey with about 97,000 persons in the sample for the 2016 early release estimates, which we were interested in. Yet it's a really good tool. It's an in-person interview, and it's considered a very good tool to measure uninsurance rates. So what we did here is we borrowed strengths from a very large survey that I'll talk about again in this talk many times. It's called the American Community Survey. It's the largest US household survey. It samples approximately 3.5 million addresses per year. So it's a large survey. So we borrow strength from ACS, which has a similar question. We borrow strength from the previous year because at the time these are released, the current year would not be available. So I'll tell you exactly which model we use for this later, but I wanted to give you a little preview that here, just borrowing strengths from another survey without using any other covariates, we saw a decrease in variance from the direct estimate of up to 78%, depending on which state you're looking at, with a median decrease of 66%. So that's quite a lot, considering that we did not use any other information but just borrow strength from the American Community Survey using the NHS as the primary survey. And I will go over exactly the model we use here. So looking at the estimates here, these are the direct estimates and these are the model estimates. So you see that these are similar, more or less, but on the other side, you're seeing the variance here and the percentage decreases in variances. This is the direct estimate sampling variance, and this is the percentage decrease, and then you can see it increases the bigger your variance is from the NHIS. So this is a really nice feature. And you can also more examples, but I wanted to show a couple of motivating examples. This one actually is not combining surveys, it's combining surveys with administrative records and also with censuses and using spatial information. But I just wanted to illustrate something here, which is, so this is a project we did at NORC, estimating anemia for children under 5 in Peru for provinces. And we did a fake aerial model, which I'll discuss later. So we use spatial information and we use administrative records and censuses. So these are the direct methods that you'd get using just the survey data and just using the survey weighted estimators. And these are the model estimators in the map. And what I wanted to show here is that all these gray areas are things that would have been, are province estimates that would have been suppressed because the coefficient of variation threshold that is set by the Peru National Statistical Office is not met. And you can see there's a lot fewer of these here. So this shows you the kind of benefits you can expect using small area estimation. So it's just an illustration. This is joint work with Angelo Kotsubo. So why am I focusing today on combining surveys and SAE? So I was invited to write a review paper, and I think this is a very important topic, specifically combining information from different surveys. And by the way, this is a typo. It should be combining information from different surveys. So the reason I think this is important is that in many cases, auxiliary information can be very hard to attain and prepare for use, and then there are quality issues. So for instance, in the United States, it's quite difficult to get access to administrative records at a low level of aggregation. A few are publicly available at the higher levels of aggregation, but at a low level of aggregation, it can be very hard to get access to that. Even if you work in a statistical agency, you need to have agreements with the agency that owns it, and it can take years to procure, and you have to have a good reason. And even if you do have access to administrative records, often there's a lot of cleaning that needs to take place. Sometimes there are issues of missingness. So there are quality issues that need to be addressed. And in contrast, survey estimates are often publicly available and ready for us to use. We also focus on area level model for the same reason, partly because it would, the review paper as well as the talk would take too long if I were to do both. But area level models can be easier to apply because you don't need access to the microdata for one thing, but also often unit level models require access to covariates for all the units in the population, and that can be quite hard to attain realistically, at least in the United States. But a lot of the ideas that you use in unit level models are similar to the ideas in area level models. So if you really like unit level models, you still should get something out of this. So again, they can be easier to apply due to the less stringent data required. And this is meant as a gentle introduction rather than an exhaustive literature review, which would also be quite lengthy. You could probably write a book. So this is just meant to introduce you to the subject. So what are some reasons to combine surveys in small area estimation? So I'll give you a couple of examples of each reason that I cover. There's of course more reasons, but these are some examples. So one reason is to extend coverage. So this is on a problem of chronic health conditions. So sometimes different surveys cover different segments of the population, and I have an example here. So the NHIS, which I mentioned earlier, does not cover nursing homes or assisted living facilities. And if you're interested in the senior population, of course, there will be a considerable number of seniors who live in such facilities. So there's another survey that specifically focuses on that. So combining them, of course, provides better coverage of the senior population. So there's some reference here. Another example is cancer risk factors and screening. And here's the reference. So for instance, this is the BRFSS, Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, is a large telephone survey. But of course, it excludes non-telephone households, and it also has a high non-response on account of being a telephone survey. The NHIS is an in-person survey and it has a much better response rate, but the sample size is much smaller. However, it includes both telephone and non-telephone households. So we combine the estimates from BRFSS and the NHIS to estimate the county level prevalence of cancer risk factors and screening. So that is done here, and this is an example that is actually a small area example, and I will talk more about this later. So again, this is an example of combining surveys to improve coverage. And that aspect, although that example, so that example is certainly relevant in small area estimation. So another example is reacting to changes. It could be changes in methodology, respondent patterns, environmental events, etc. And so one example I'm giving here is when the US changed race classifications and allowed individuals to select more than one race group instead of just one race group. But there was an interest for comparability to see what they would have been. So in the Census 2000, the new definition was applied, but there was an interest to understand what it would have been because it served as a denominator in a quantity of interest. So we wanted to know what the Census 2000 estimates would have been on the old race criteria. So this is another example of reacting to changes. So we use the NHIS because it allows to select multiple races, but also ask a question about which race best represents you. So this example comes from here, and you can also see these other references. Another example is a recent one, and even though this was not a small area problem, but the approach here, but the same idea applies. This one is a small area estimation paper. It's a very interesting one that I'll go over in more detail. So basically, it relates to the survey of fishing, hunting, and wildlife associated recreation. And the specific estimate here is fishing participation that the authors are focusing on. It comes from this paper here by Arculescu, Opsomer, and Bright. So the concern was the changing population trends affecting comparability of estimates over a year. So specifically, one pattern that we see in a lot of surveys here is an increasing non-response, and that may be as a result of the growing difficulty in reaching the public in traditional survey modes. So a second survey was conducted by the Rockville Institute at the same time as the regular surveys, asking very similar questions, but a different sample design and the sample selection process and mode. So this allowed comparisons. And again, we'll talk about this small area model in detail later. So one common reason to want to do small area estimation is that perhaps the survey that you're interested in, the survey that's accurate for what you want, only provides estimates at a high level of aggregation and can only support that because of small sample sizes. So what one can do is, if there is another larger survey that measures similar characteristics, we can combine these two to try to obtain characteristics at a lower level of aggregation. And this one example is this, the one I mentioned previously, which we'll discuss, the model that was used later. So in this case, then they had the original national survey only supported estimates for census divisions, while the 50-state survey supported state level estimates. So they combined them to have estimates in both occurrences, which is the term that they like to use, in the state and division level. So here, even though the surveys ask similar questions, there's they have basically their expected value is actually different. There's a bias relative to each other, because when you have different modes, different time and different modes, and etc., you usually end up having a bias of one service relative to another. And that's something that's important to keep in mind when you think about writing models to combine surveys. Another example is one that I'm working on now myself. So this is interesting. We have this survey called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It estimates hearing loss. And the sample size actually can only support national estimates, but it can be by age group, race, and gender. It's around 5,000 samples per year. But the interesting thing about it is that there is medical professionals that actually measure hearing loss, and they measure 2 levels of hearing loss. So of course, it's quite an accurate tool, because a medical professional measuring hearing loss is better than the self-reporting of hearing loss. On the other hand, ACS has 3.5 million addresses per year, but here hearing loss is binary and self-reported. So we ask someone in the household, does someone in your household have hearing loss? And the answer. So obviously they're not medical professionals. So we're working to combine NHANES and ACS along with administrative records to obtain county-level demographic group estimates for 2 hearing loss types measured by NHANES. And this is a work in progress with some colleagues at NORC, and I also will give some modeling details later. And then, of course, the last one is borrowing strengths to decrease uncertainty methods. And I already showed one example where you can borrow strengths from ACS to get a very large variance reduction from relative to this smaller survey. So the idea is that you borrow strengths from the larger survey and you get large variance reduction. But I mean, you use the smaller survey because it's a better tool, or it's measuring the thing that you're interested in, whereas the larger survey is measuring something related but not quite what you want. I'm going to talk about some useful types of model, and I use the word some on purpose because there are lots of types of model, but I think these are useful and common that allow you to combine estimates from surveys. So multivariate models jointly model estimates from different surveys or from the same survey. So measurement error, models, they treat estimates from other surveys as covariate, but account for their sampling error. Bridging models can be used to combine surveys at different levels of aggregation. Temporal models are appropriate for surveys that happen repeated over time. So if you have estimates for many time points, you can use temporal models. I won't go over in detail temporal models here because there just wouldn't be enough time, and they're slightly out of scope if we're talking about combining different surveys. I put some references here about temporal models if you're interested in reading more. And one thing I wanted to point out, just because this is a common error in practice, is so suppose you have estimates from another survey, and you shouldn't just blindly put them as covariates without accounting for the sampling error. In fact, we studied this question in a paper in 2019, and we showed that this can result in not only suboptimal model predictions, but also incorrect mean squared error estimates. And you can even have, in some cases, estimates that are worse than the direct estimators in terms of variance, if you use a naive model that ignores the sampling error. So I just wanted to put a warning here. So I'll talk more about it later when I go to measurement error model, because doing that is basically a measurement error type problem. But you can use the other types of models we mentioned here, or other methods that account for sampling variance of all survey estimates used. So, and if you do decide that you have to ignore measurement error because maybe your problem is too complicated and it's difficult to account for it, I would suggest that you at least try to assess the impact of ignoring measurement error. It is true that for some complex models, it may not be straightforward to account for measurement error, but you should always at least think about the issue and make sure that you're not getting effects that you are not aware of. So before we can go into the technicalities of some models that borrow strengths from different surveys, we should discuss a little bit area level models for just one survey. So here I'm showing the famous Fay-Herriot model. And so let me go through it. So this is the survey estimate, this is the truth, and this is the sampling error. And so this first level says that the survey estimate is equal to the truth plus the sampling error. We typically assume this to be normal 0 BI, and we assume BI is known for identifiability. But typically BI is some estimate of the sampling variance of the direct estimator. And this second level relates the truth, the underlying truth, to the covariates and has a model error or area random effect. And again, often we assume that this is normal. It's not necessary to assume normality, and this is a parameter that needs to be estimated, as is beta. So this is called the sampling level, and this is called the linking level. When the parameters are known, the best linear predictors of theta I is this convex combination of the direct estimator and what we call the synthetic estimator. And the really nice thing about this is that if you notice BI here, if you may not recall, but this is the sampling variance of y hat. And notice that if this is really small, all the weight goes to y hat. This means that for areas that have very good direct estimators, all the weight actually goes to the direct estimators, but when this is very large, more weight goes here, which is good because when you have a very large variant, sampling variance, then you want to exploit your covariates more. So this is a very nice feature of the failure model, and even though it's not always possible to express it like this, similar phenomena happen with other area level models. In practice, the parameters are not known, and so you can use hierarchical based or empirical based fitting. And for the fake area model, there is packages to do this in empirical base, the SA package, and you could use Stan or JAGS for this. So many models have the sampling model and linking model, so I wanted to highlight that. And another thing I wanted to highlight is that the sampling variance is not known, but we assume it's known, as I mentioned. So it's recommended that you smooth before using it. And if you want to see some examples, I have some in this recent paper of ours. So this is a simulation study. So basically, generalized variance functions, assuming a common design, averaging, etc., is the type of thing that people do to smooth. I wanted to emphasize that you don't need to assume normality. The fake error is not the only option. So for instance, for proportion, sometimes the fake error is not great because the normality assumption, when you have very small proportions, you have lots of zeros. And so, you know, the probability of 0 is 0 for a normal distribution, the probability of any value is 0. But if you have lots of zeros, this can be unrealistic and you can have skewness. So instead, in the sampling level, you could assume a binomial distribution given Pi and Ni, and you can use a logit transformation, for instance, to get things in the right scale since Pi is between 0 and 1. So it's a nice model that naturally handles zeros, estimates, and skewness. And it's not hard to extend it in various ways by variant models, temporal models, categorical responses. So if instead of having binary things like poverty or no poverty, you might have something like employed, unemployed, and out of the workforce. Then you can use multinomial logit normal models. What I showed earlier did not capture the complex sampling features of that most surveys have, but it's not difficult to do so approximately by using the effective sample size and sample count. And so I'll let you look at these for the details because I don't have time to go over it. But the idea is to use approximations based on the design effect. So it is possible to approximately incorporate the effect of complex sampling in the BLM model. And there are many other area level models that are possible. So these are just a couple of examples. So multivariate models jointly model 2 or more estimates. So you can use this to get variance reductions, and you can get quite large variance reduction. But keep in mind that the variance reduction will typically happen only for the smaller survey, borrowing strains from the larger survey, and our paper illustrates that. It's also useful to use multivariate models or other models that jointly model estimates. It's when you're interested in functions of quantities measured by the multiple estimates, such as year-to-year changes, indices based on different quantities, etc. So for instance, you might have some kind of economic index or a healthcare index, and you may have the quantities you need in different services, so then you want to model them jointly. And a multivariate model is one way to do it. So extending the fake area model to multivariate is pretty straightforward. So think of this as the estimate from one survey, and think of this as the estimate from another survey. And you can see that these two lines are basically two replicas of the univariate fake area model. But the trick here is that the model errors are now allowed to be correlated, which allows you to capture whatever dependence was not already captured by the covariate, whatever dependence between the model errors. So in general, the higher the correlation between these model errors, the more you can get benefits from borrowing strength, although it depends on other factors as well. The sampling errors can also be assumed to be jointly normal. And here, if the two surveys were different, if you're using this model with two different surveys, typically this would be diagonal, because typically two different surveys don't have lots of overlap in sample and are run independently. Now, if these were estimates from the same survey, it's important to capture this. And this, again, is assumed known here. So you'd have to estimate it from the microdata and maybe smooth it. It's also straightforward to extend the Blm model to multivariate. Same idea, you have two replicas here, and the model errors are jointly normal. And here, we didn't write it, but there is an implicit assumption of conditional independence of this y tildes, given the piece and the effective sample sizes. And that's kind of analogous to saying that the sampling is independent. And it's realistic when these are two different estimates from two different surveys. If these are estimates from the same survey, then this would not be realistic. And like the fake area model, you can use a hierarchical base or empirical base approach. So you can fit this, for instance, in JAX or STAN, if you're using a hierarchical base. And again, I promise I tell you this. What I showed you at the beginning, I gave you a preview, so now I'll tell you all the details. We actually used, to get those benefits I showed at the beginning, we use a bivariate Gaussian, and we use a bivariate BNN with no covariates. So again, there was no need to go through the trouble of finding and cleaning up covariates, and we have these large benefits in variances. So again, we borrow strength from the previous year's estimate. So the extension to more dimensions is straightforward, and I think you could probably imagine how to do it. And one interesting example is Raghunathan et al. They use a trivariate fake area model with arcs and transformation using a hierarchical based implementation. And this is returning to the example I talked about at the beginning, where they use NHIS telephone and NHIS non-telephone and BRFSS. Those are the three estimates they are modeling together. At the county level for various time points. For these two, you would only have a few estimates at the county level that are available, but for this, you'd have a lot more. So this, again, not only improves the coverage, but allows them to borrow strength and to provide estimates at the county level that would not otherwise be possible. So one interesting thing to keep in mind is that the model does specify a bias of one survey relative to the other. And one thing I wanted to emphasize is that often when surveys, even if they're measuring the same thing, if they have different modes or the timing is different, there's usually a bias between one survey relative to the other, and that's an important thing to keep in mind when you build your own models. Another type of models is measure error models, which are similar to multivariate models, but they treat the estimates from other surveys as covariates with random error. So basically, there are two types, structural and functional measurement error, and I'll discuss them here. So the first two lines look like the fake area model, but the last line, so here, this little xi is the true covariate, but we don't observe it. We observe capital Xi. And capital Xi has a sampling error. Once again, we assume it's known, and Ci is the sampling variance of capital Xi. So it's important to account for the sampling variance. And this is just as before. And so there's two ways in which we can complete the specification of this model. Under functional measurement error model, we treat Xi as fixed and unknown. And under structural measurement error, we treat Xi as random, and we assume it follows some kind of model. It could be as simple as having mu x sigma x squared normal. And this, when you look at these two, they may seem subtle, but there's actually large differences in the implications for the mean squared error. So here's an expression for functional ME model that was shown by Ibarra and Lohr. And we see that again, we have this convex combination between the direct estimator and the synthetic part, but notice that now the weights depend on the sampling error of the covariant measurement measure with error. And this one, so does the mean squared error. And this is the EBLAP. And the expression for structural ME is more complicated. One thing that's interesting, it's not hard to derive using the properties of the multivariate normal distribution. And one interesting point, though, is that you can verify that if sigma squared x goes to infinity, this difference goes to 0. That means like you know nothing about Xi because the variance is huge. So this means like the structural measurement error model is very similar to the functional measurement error model. So we have a paper that I mentioned earlier that compares naive model and that ignores measurement error. So I'll just quickly talk about it. We already talked about the problems with the naive. There's other interesting findings here. So it turns out that, so we used asymptotic approximations of the true MSEs, assuming either FME or SME are true separately. And one interesting thing we find that is that the FME can sometimes do worse than SME, even when we assume it's true, and even worse than the naive. So that was a bit surprising, but it does not mean that you should necessarily use the naive model. Like I said, they have problems. Typically, in many cases, they're worse than the structural or functional. And they're also having correct mean squared errors if you just blindly run a fake Harriot and put the covariate with error in as if it didn't. And so this, because it's asymptotic, only covers the case of Blm, but still should shed useful insights and gives a warning against the naive. And the last type of model that I discussed is bridging models. So we're coming back to the example we talked about at the beginning. So we have national estimates at the division level, 50 state estimates at the state level. And we are interested in state estimates and the national currency. So I'll tell you how they do the modeling. They have Gaussian models for the respective survey estimates at the level of aggregation. And they assume a relationship between the true quantities at the lower level of aggregation. So suppose IR census division, states within division, and these are the true quantities, UIJC and UIGRI are the true quantities in the currency of the national 50-state surveys. So the sampling models are similar to the fake Harriot model. Then they assume this bridging part, and they fit using STAN. The full models here, so you have this is kind of like the sampling models we've seen, and this is the bridging level. So this is actually kind of strong. They're saying that at the notice that this here is unobserved. This is what the truth would be if you observe the quantity from the national level survey. C is the national level survey, and they are assuming perfect correlation, which is kind of strong. But often we need to make assumptions that are strong, and that's okay if it's reasonable for the applications. And I've actually talked to the authors on this, and they said that yes, for this application, this is realistic. It should be possible to kind of relax this assumption. So there's some more details of the model that you might want to look on your own if you're interested. We had a similar problem in hearing loss estimates that I talked about earlier. So we have national estimates from NHANES, the age group, sex, race, etc. And then we have county estimates by age, and we had an interest in county, age, gender, and race. So the general approach is to have separate models, multinomial for the NHANES, because we have 3 hearing loss, mild, severe, and normal, and BLM for the ACS model, because we have only binomial logit normal. That's the one we talked about, because we have binary. You either have hearing loss or you don't. And we use calibration to make sure that the county estimates add up to the NHANES model's estimates for normal, mild, and severe. So this also is a strong assumption, but here bridging models would have been quite challenging, because we have a huge amount of small areas. We have rare data with very small proportions and lots of zeros. And so these cases are quite difficult, but nonetheless, from a public health perspective, having these estimates is of great value. And so it's still a contribution, but future research might look at bridging models. So in conclusion, there are many reasons to combine surveys in small area estimation, and there's a strong potential for benefits in many applications. I think we've all heard this quote, probably it's very famous, all models are wrong, but some are useful. But what I wanted to remember is to be aware of assumptions being made, and obviously try to avoid ones that you know are incorrect, such as naive models in this case. And you should also consider and assess the effect of model specification. If you know it's there, you should at least check what impact it has. And perform model diagnostics and checks and common sense checks. And if you have a subject matter expert, they can often look at your estimates and tell you if they're reasonable. So many useful models are already available, and there's lots of room for extensions. So we hope that our review paper will provide an accessible introduction to the subject. And I put here a couple of references. I gave a 90-minute webinar introducing smaller estimation. If you're interested, you could look at that. It's quite hard to even introduce SAE in just 90 minutes. This is the standard reference that people use, and the UN has a very nice toolkit that has lots of useful resources. So thank you, and I think now we can start taking questions.
Thanks so much, Carolina, for this speedy overview of small area estimations. I know it's very hard to do it in such a short time. Nevertheless, we hope that people got a good grasp of what is possible and how you can improve basically your survey results by combining surveys. So now I would like to open up the floor for anyone who has questions. So as mentioned before, either you can raise your hand. So there at the top, there's a little reactions field. And when you click there, there's a raise hand field icon, which you can click on. Or you can write also your questions into the chat if you wish. That's also fine. So please don't be shy. Ask your questions. Yeah, so here's the first question from CD. Thank you so much for the presentation. Which statistical package do you recommend for small area estimations?
I don't know that I want to recommend one package, but I could mention a few that I've used. Personally, I tend to use Stan and Jax a lot. So you need to learn a little bit, but it's not that hard to learn. And sometimes when I have a quick turnaround project, there's an SAE package that was developed by Maruenda Molina. If you are in I can tell you a couple of things that might be useful. One, the essay toolkit that Hawaii was very much heavily involved with, put together a list of software that you can use for smaller estimation. I thought that was extremely useful. So that's something to keep in mind. The 90-minute webinar that I referred to earlier, which also seemed like a short time to discuss smaller estimation, even though it's longer than I had now. That one has some comments on that too. I think your best resource is the essay toolkit because they listed a lot of things. Personally, I use a lot of JAGS and STAN and the essay package by Maruenda Molina when I want to do something frequentist. I've used LME4 for binomial logic normal models, but the MSC estimation is more complicated. The LME4 is a frequentist package. So, but the variance estimation gets complicated unless there's something I don't know about. But yes, the best thing is to check out the toolkit because they did a great job looking for packages.
Thanks. I also see Chris Nanatu, I hope I don't mispronounce your name, has the hand up. Chris, you want to unmute yourself? Please also tell where you are from and which organization you work for. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Alexander. Yes, I am Chris. I work with the World Pub at the University of Southampton in the UK. Thank you so much, Carolina, for that very brilliant presentation. Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, so my question is around the Blm model which you presented. So the Blm model looks very interesting to me because within the World Pub, what we do is we model population for countries, and we do have quite a number of challenges, data import challenges, and we have all of these things in subunits of the population, and we're trying out quite a couple of methods. We have existing methods, but we do develop a lot of new methods. And one of the new, projects that we have now, we are looking to do something very similar to the Blm method, but our data sets are counts, which are Poisson distributed. And then the introduction, or the description that you gave within the Blm method, you've mostly used normal distribution. You've used the Gaussian distribution. So I was wondering whether or not if it's not going to be applicable for when the response is counted.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. First, I should make clear that's not my paper. It's somebody else's paper. But I'm actually also very interested in this topic, Chris. And I've been thinking about the same thing that you're thinking, because in my application that I discussed, that is a work in progress, we have it's not realistic to use normality. I explained that I have a binomial for one survey and multinomial for another survey. And I will tell you my opinion. I don't think anyone's tried to do it like that, but in my opinion, it's possible to use other asymptotics. It will be an extension of the paper, Herculescu, Wright, and Opsomer. In my opinion, you can do it that way. It's just a matter of fitting it. You could try STAN first, and this is what they used. So you could try to do something similar to what they did. But in theory, there's no reason why you couldn't have another distribution. I have the same idea too. I have not implemented it yet because our data set is very complex. We have 150,000 small areas. So in my data set, I suspect it's not going to work, but that's because my data set's very complex. We have rare characteristics. Hearing loss is very rare among people who are young. so children and etc. So, but in general, in my opinion, that would be an interesting extension, definitely worth trying. I cannot promise it will work because it hasn't been done, but in my opinion, you could do it with other distribution, and hopefully you'd get convergence. And I think you could try writing it in Stan, like they did.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And that's all from me for now. So I will give chance for other people to ask questions. Thank you very much. That's satisfying.
Thanks, Chris, for the question. So we have about 3-4 minutes left before we have to adjourn today. So we can still take like 1 or 2 questions. So please go, let me have a look at the chat. So there's a question from Rabi El-Hupta. Which variables would you recommend to use in small area estimation models from different censuses or censuses for extending poverty estimates at smaller levels of area disaggregation, such as cities?
Interesting, and it depends on the country and the availability. I can tell you what they have in SAPI. In SAPI, the biggest SAPI is the United States Poverty Estimates Program, and it uses small area estimation. So in SAPI, they are using one of the most valuable covariates they have is the tax records. So you can compute pseudo poverty from the tax record. So you can figure out, and this is at the area level because not everyone files taxes in the United States. So that's one thing that you could use. In the United States, we also we have food subsidies programs that and that are for the poor individuals or households, and those administrative records are quite valuable as well. And so those are the classic ones. You certainly can get creative. There's a lot of sources out there. So it kind of depends on what you have at your availability. Like what I do first, if you're in a national statistical office, is look at what your registries measure and see what may be correlated with poverty. But I did give you some examples related to SAPI. So hopefully that helps. In the United States, we also have one that is who doesn't file taxes, because in the United States, the most poor people are not required to file taxes. So in short, it's kind of country specific, and it depends on what you have available to you. But perhaps taxes could be useful as well in different countries.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we will need to stop hard today at 10 o'clock New York time, because Carolina has another meeting she needs to go to. I just wanted to say 2 things. So first of all, if you have additional questions, Carolina is also on the global network of data officers and statisticians, so we will share the presentation and the slides there. They will also be shared on the website of the Intersecretariat Working Group on Household Surveys. But if you have questions for Carolina, you can follow up with her on the global network. That's number 1. Number 2, please now all your mics, unmute yourself and put your camera on so Carolina can see the big crowd behind this talk, and give Carolina a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, yes, and I'll be happy to answer questions in Yammer for sure. I'm new to it, but I'll try to. I'll check it for sure.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining today. Thank you, Carolina, for the presentation. Thanks, Howie, for bringing such a great speaker to the Global Network webinars. It's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your days and see you next time with our Global Network webinars. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.